This video is a book review on this book, Trees and Development by Nelda Matheny and James Clark. This is a technical guide to preservation of trees during land development. And what development refers to is the whole process of kind of acquiring the land, making plans on how you're going to change it up, construction, post-construction, stuff like that. This is available through the ISA website. On the website right now, for members, it's about $52, and for non-members, it's $82. I would say it's absolutely worth it if you're going to do anything related to development. So if you're a tree worker or an arborist, sales arborist, and you've never been involved in development projects, it is a completely different beast. And if you don't have someone who's guiding you, then you should get this book. This one was published in 1998, so at this time, 2026, it's 28 years old. It shows its age in the chapters that are talking about tech or preparing reports and plans. There's talks of printing out plans, using specific papers, basically doing a lot of work by hand. But otherwise, it's surprising how little things have changed in these 30 years. The problems they talk about in this book relating to the issues trees deal with during construction is still the same. There might be some more cities, especially in wealthy areas, that have more tree protection requirements, but even in those cities, it's still the same. It essentially is ordered based on the process of development. After the intro sections, the overview, it goes from what might you be called to do at the very beginning stages, when it comes time to looking at the site, reviewing plans, writing your report. It is organized basically in the order that you would take a project as you are working on it. My personal use of this book in the past has been pretty limited until I decided to read this book for the video. Even though I've been doing development projects for about 10 years, I never read the book. The only thing that I referred to was this Appendix B, which is the tolerance of different species to construction impacts. And then there's a section in here which is the optimal tree protection zone. I was able to get by without reading this book because I had a boss who taught me almost everything, and what I didn't know, I would go to YouTube videos, I would Google, I would just look up all these different construction resources to better understand it. Here's a table of contents for the books, and I'll order my review based on this order with a little bit more detail. The first one is Guiding Principles of Development, and the second one is Primer on Tree Bio. I don't have a lot to say on those, except I do recommend reading it, even the Primer on Tree Biology, because the focus of that chapter is more the aspects of tree biology that are relevant to development. First one, the one about the guidelines on tree preservation, does give you some arguments for tree preservation. A lot of clients or contractors don't want the hassle of having to work around trees, but there is some monetary benefit to having a landscape that has established trees already. Chapter 3 is a primer on the development process. It talks about different stages of the development process, the designers and the contractors, members of the project team that you might encounter at different stages. It also talks about tree preservation ordinances and where an arborist might come in at each of those different stages. I think that this section might be overwhelming for a new arborist to look at. It's a lot of information, so maybe as you encounter one part or another, you can just refer to this section after you've looked through it to understand what's in it. I like that they reiterated that you have to cooperate with the design team, the project team, which can involve different engineers, architects, client, builder, developer, stuff like that. The goal is cooperation because everyone's working within certain limits that are certain constraints that are placed upon them. The next chapter is chapter 4, Tools of the Trade, Development Plans and Construction Practice. This chapter has an overview of plans, symbols, different types of plans like aerial looking from above, sections and elevations looking from the side, how to read a topo map, how to read some parts of the other plans you might encounter, how to read survey stakes, and also goes over different phases of construction like demolition, grading, foundations, and stuff like that. This is a chapter that aims for broad, like an inclusion of a broad amount of information. There's a lot of terms in there. They use words as an example, but they don't necessarily define it. For example, riprap, concrete aprons, drop structures. Those just show up and they're not explained again. But at least it will give you an exposure to these terms. The next chapter is chapter 5, evaluation of the resource. And what they mean is evaluation of the trees. In this section, they talk about what work you might do on a macro scale down to an individual tree scale. So on the macro scale, you might have a parcel of some native areas, and you would break down what kind of species distribution you have, or you can get down to the individual tree level, at which point maybe you're collecting species, diameter, height, health, whatever, all these little details, and they give you some examples of data that you might want to include. And here's an example that they have for how your data table may look. They also have a section that talks very, very quickly about appraisal. It's maybe one paragraph, and I think that's a little bit of that's a section that could be expanded. For a lot of arborists that work in near areas with development projects are how you get into appraisal. I only learned to do tree appraisal because it was required by many of these cities. Chapter 6 is designing for tree preservation. The main thing here is that you want to preserve trees that are going to be suitable for the site for the long term. You don't want to pick old trees or trees on the edge of where a bunch of other trees are being cleared, because these do not have the same longevity in the long term as other trees. You have to balance this with what the client wants, which, depending on the project, may be to keep the old large trees, even if they're not doing well, because they're more stately. They make more of a statement or an impact from a public perspective. This chapter also goes into different approaches to how you create a tree protection zone around the tree. How large should it be, really? There's no real consensus on what's the best. They have their own little calculation, kind of like a formula based on the trunk diameter, and it takes something from the British Standards Institute and adds on the relative species tolerance to construction. And if you take that and you base it on the age of the tree as well, then you get this calculation for optimal tree protection zone. So I think this is where a lot of people, especially newer consultants, they get hung up on this because this is optimal. But what optimal means is that, if you have an optimal tree protection zone, your tree is probably guaranteed to survive, because this is an area that is going to be, things are going to be super delicate or sensitive. There's could be no impacts within this area. It's ideal, but there are very few ideal situations. And if you cannot get an optimal tree protection zone, it does not mean that you can't save that tree. So for people who are less experienced and they stick to rules of thumb and calculations like this, you end up removing more trees than you actually need to. The authors do emphasize in different parts of the book that, root distribution is not perfect. So the optimal tree protection zone kind of assumes that you have perfect roots radiating out from the trunk in all directions. That's not how the real world works. But they talk about that a little bit more later. Chapter 6 is a short chapter, but it's a really important one. And it should really be used in combination with Chapter 7. So Chapter 7 is the evaluation of tree impacts. And it explains how different processes have direct or indirect effects on trees and what those impacts are. It also talks about the differences in, like I was saying, how roots are actually dispersed in a place where existing development has occurred. Even if there hasn't been development, there could be stuff underneath the surface of the soil, natural features like rock or perched water tables. These are all things that can affect how roots grow, but you don't know that when you're working with a calculation off the trunk or with the drip line. A quote from the book: "Frequently we are surprised to dig along one side of a mature tree and encounter no woody roots." But on the flip side, they also mention that sometimes they're working far away from a tree and they find some big ass roots. And that tracks with my experience. Some big ass trees, we could be really close, so close that I don't feel comfortable condemning the tree, but also I don't want to let that project go if there's a lot of roots. Client digs a trench, no roots. It's always a surprise. In that situation, if you don't know where the root distribution is, they also talk about ways of figuring that out. Mainly, digging a trench would be a great one, and it just helps you look at what you're actually working with. The next chapter is chapter 8, minimizing impacts and preparing specifications. This chapter is probably one of the most helpful things that arborists can do as part of the process, which is to give information and ideas to the project team to try to preserve trees. As an overview, there's a table in here that includes the construction activity, the ways that activity impacts trees, and some ideas on how to adjust the design to accommodate the trees. Some of the ones that I have definitely used myself are using retaining walls instead of grading the surface, using reinforced concrete so that the concrete itself has more strength and you don't need to prepare the ground as much. You don't have to dig down and compact as much. Or using pier footings, which are separate, or pier and grade beam. A grade beam is a horizontal piece that connects the piers. But most specifically, that grade beam is usually below grade, meaning they have to dig a continuous trench anyway. So you need to specify, and the engineer needs to design it so that that grade beam is either sitting on grade or above it. When you're working with design team members, you might find that some of them are not as well versed in tree preservation as others. You can give them these ideas. Stuff like, can you stay X feet away from this tree? Can you use this kind of foundation instead? And you leave it up to them and their creative juices to design within your specs. And it's always easier to ask for more because you might be surprised by what you could get away with. You can just ask for more, and if they're not able to give it, then you can consider, with what they're able to give you, will this tree make it or not? So I think that this would be a very helpful section for newcomers. And at the end, it has a list of sample tree protection recommendations, basically. So that would be a great starting point if you've never written an arborist report with those specs or put together a plan with those specs. That's a good example, but you would just have to rework it to match your project and rework it into your own words. The next chapter, chapter 9, is the construction phase. This chapter stresses the importance of a pre-construction meeting where all the relevant contractors and project team members get together and talk about different things. This is where you can bring up tree protection, talk about questions, things like that. In my experience, this is a nice idea. Sometimes it happens, but it usually doesn't include everybody. It also has a list of things to look for when you're doing a construction monitoring visit. These could be client driven, or they could be part of the city requirements. And if you see damages, some basic damages, how you can address them. There is an inspection form in here. I I personally don't have a form of any kind when it comes to looking at a construction site. I just do it in an email or a letter format. But this one's interesting. I might do something like this, and it's very clear and it presents information well. Chapter 10 is post-construction management, which focuses on the period where you're transitioning from the project being done to the new owners if there's a change. This is a phase where you can make some final recommendations as to how to correct problems. Sometimes it's a little too late for that, but how you can mitigate problems and to report on some things that occurred maybe when you weren't there. Oftentimes I'll find that maybe trees were removed that they shouldn't have been removed, and so the city gets a chance to levy fines or stuff like that against the developer. This assessment is a little bit difficult. Sometimes even if you've been a part of the project from the very beginning, because you don't get, unless it's a super high profile sensitive site, you're not there all the time, and maybe you were just there for the report. Maybe you were called once or twice and then you get called at the very end. So it's really up to you to look at how things have changed around the tree to the best of your ability. Injuries to the trees themselves, grading, compaction, stuff like that, to make your best guess. They also have some suggestions on how you might mitigate compacted soil, mulch and radial trenching being the most effective ones, and how you manage remnant forests, like edge trees and things like that are now subject to different wind conditions. The last chapter is chapter 11, preparing reports and plans. This table of different types of tree reports and what you might include in there, and it references different chapters within this book where you could find some information. And what I thought was helpful, a couple of different examples, but I think that it could have been improved if they actually had a full report. I think that would be interesting. And this is a chapter where the tech differences in the past 30 years really shows up. The next section is case studies. I actually really like these. I think they're really interesting to look at. The one that I find personally interesting is Shield's library expansion. I went to UC Davis. I think the writers of these books may be UC Davis alums, and I've seen this tree. It's a library that the library expanded to fully enclose this turkey oak in the courtyard. Talks about all the different things that they were able to achieve to save that tree. There's also this case study, which is the reconstruction of Main Street in Pleasanton, California. That's the city where the authors were based, and I'm thinking I'm gonna go check it out because I live about 40 minutes from there. And what I found interesting about this case study specifically is that they talked about roots that were cut. 6 to 8 inch diameter roots were cut within 5 feet of the trunk. So for 7 trees there was severe damage, but this summary was written 4 years after the project was done, and the trees survived and were growing well. So I would definitely like to go see if I can find these trees, but it just goes to show you can cut some big ass roots sometimes and the trees still be fine. Maybe fine is a little bit subjective, but especially with sidewalk repair jobs, there are such huge swaths of tree roots that get cut right next to a trunk, and a lot of those trees do remain in place for many years after that. And then there are 2 appendices. One of them the first one is equipment and supplies for preparing maps and plans. That one is not relevant to us anymore because it talks about doing stuff by hand with a copier and stuff like that. But the one that most helpful appendix, relative tolerance of selected species to development impacts. The author said this in the ASCA forum. This appendix is anecdotal. The sources that they cite may have their own citations, but this is not research based. This is just practicing arborists who over time observed that trees could tolerate a lot more impacts than other ones. So it's organized by scientific name that was current at the time of the writing. So some of these are no longer current. It has the common name, scientific name, the relative tolerance, comments. So for example, here's one on Acer macrophyllum, which is the big leaf maple. It's listed as both good and poor, and there's two sources. So what you also want to do is look at the source and figure out which person is closer to you, because there's a certain species like that one that have opposite reactions depending on the geography. In my area, London plane trees, which is Platanus x hispanica, has high tolerance, but in another area it's actually poor tolerance, so it can be very different. This book is super falling apart, which you can see. Actually the pages fall out, but I got this from an arborist who is one of the sources in this book. So she had started writing her other impressions based on her other experience. She started writing a whole bunch of other tolerances in here, which I really appreciate, and I've been adding more to it. And I'm like, when I get a new copy of this, I'm gonna do my best to move this information to that new copy as well. And the last appendix is FAQs. It's kind of like, I'm not sure how useful it is. It's very short. It's just this half a page, but maybe it would be like, what is a good tree preservation ordinance? So it gives you a book about tree preservation ordinances and a list of some ordinances that they talked about in one of the chapters. So you might find it helpful. For me, it wasn't all that helpful at this point in time. There is no index or glossary, so it's going to be hard to go back and look for information, but I also understand because there's just so much information in there. And I would say that this book would basically be your go-to overview, and for anything that you run into in this book, you would I would suggest supplementing that by looking at construction related references, YouTube videos, websites, things like that. I do plan on making videos related to this, reviewing plans, reading plans, for example. I don't know when I'm going to be able to do that, and especially when I might be able to correlate plans with stuff that I see in the field. So for now, get the book.